Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. So as Rhonda said, my name is Dr. Megan Weir, and I'm a research fellow at the Centre for Social Impact at UNSW and the lead researcher for the Social Progress Index in Australia. Before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge that today I'm on Gadigal and Bidjigal land, and one advantage of moving to Zoom meetings this year has meant that I've been able to get more familiar with different countries and custodians where my colleagues and contacts are living and working. So Isabella, can you introduce yourself and tell us what country you're on today?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Isabella Saunders and I'm a research assistant at CSI. I've also been one of the primary researchers for the Australian Social Progress Index. I'm on Gadigal land today, and I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present.
So one thing that I've often said when talking about the SPI and talking about acknowledging country is that when we talk about and think about progress, it's often with this intent of looking forward to the future that we want. But in order to have a truly progressive society, we also need to be able to look backwards and see where there have been historical injustices for First Nations people in Australia and recognise the ongoing impact that colonisation, including things like the stolen generations, dispossession of land and decades of stolen wages, has had on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to this day. So we can't have a progressive society unless we're willing to confront these uncomfortable histories and disrupt systems that allow marginalisation and disadvantage to continue. So with that, I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present, both on the lands where I am today, but also across Australia, including any who may be joining us here today, and also recognise that we are meeting on land where sovereignty was never ceded. So for those who are less familiar with the Centre for Social Impact, we're a collaboration between the University of New South Wales, Swinburne University of Technology, and the University of Western Australia. Put broadly, our aim and purpose is to catalyse positive social change. This means taking an honest look at our society, where there are disparities and injustices, and our focus is on equipping communities and organisations with the skills to be able to work together for a more equitable society. One of the major projects that we've been working on currently at UNSW is called the Amplify Social Impact Project, where we aim to help the for-purpose sector better understand our current society, its needs and ability to respond to social issues. And one of those focuses is on economic inequality and its impact on social progress. So Australia, compared to the rest of the world, has been an undeniably successful economic country. Up until the COVID crisis, we had seen continuous growth in our gross domestic product, or GDP, over the last 29 years, including relative stability through the global financial crisis of 2007-2008. This means that we have young people who are completing high school and university and entering the workforce in social conditions where there had only ever been growth in their lifetime. The economy, keeping it strong and making policy decisions that first and foremost centre the economy, remains a strong focus, particularly for our current government. When we reflect on last week's budget announcement, spending is largely focused on supporting business and infrastructure to create jobs. Tax cuts to businesses have been passed in order to, and to quote, rebuild our economy and create more jobs to by kickstarting activity in the private sector. Then if we also reflect back to earlier in the year, the government's response to the devastation of the bushfires across Australia and Australia's response to climate change was similar. That any response first and foremost must not jeopardise Australia's vibrant and viable economy. This has also been a strong focus both globally and in Australia as governments respond to COVID, where there are calls to ensure that the economy remains open. But in advocating for this, we have to grapple with the ethical decisions about whether the economy or infection and death rates dictate policy. Australia broadly has done remarkably well in its response to COVID by responding quickly with lockdowns and funding primary healthcare. But we're also seeing increasingly now that policy priorities are reorienting towards the economy. An issue I think that many people are becoming aware of is that talking about and focusing on Australia's economy and GDP growth can feel kind of off when we're dealing with the realities of the communities where there are high levels of financial stress, homelessness, or untreated illness. There's an issue if we're only talking about GDP per capita and using that as a sole indication that the needs and circumstances of all communities across Australia are progressive. So how we generate an economy and its flow-on effect matters. While the economy is not a person, it is driven by people within that system, and our work leads us to be critical of assuming that the economy is a benign entity of its own. So during the 20th century, and I think still continues to this day to a certain extent, there was an assumption that economic development automatically generated social progress. So if GDP per capita was going up, so was the progressiveness of a society. However, we know that in many instances, economic development doesn't automatically result in social progress. In some cases, it can even harm social progress. So a relevant example for Australia that I often think of is the impact of the mining boom, both on the environment, but also the impact on communities where mining companies have resided for a few years and then left once the resources have been fully mined. Other ways of generating income, such as the exportation of arms and privatization of prisons, undeniably also can have a negative impact on individuals either here or abroad. And this relationship isn't also necessarily a one-way stream. So sometimes social progress affects economic development. The state of basic education and health in a region could have impacts on how fit and able the workforce is, for example. So in order to truly understand inclusive growth, we need a measure of social progress that is independent of economic measures that we can correlate against the economy, but also means that our understanding of the society is less muddied by dollar values. So the Amplify Social Impact Project at UNSW has partnered with international not-for-profit, the Social Progress Imperative, in creating Australia's first Social Progress Index, or the SPI. The SPI has been calculated at a global level since 2013, and it gives us an indication of how countries relative to one another compare on its ability to meet the basic human needs of its citizens, enhance and sustain quality of life, and create conditions for all individuals to reach their full potential. So it's these three domains, basic human needs, foundations of well-being, and opportunity, alongside the economy, that we believe will lead to truly inclusive growth. And an important part of the index is also that in order for social progress overall to improve, each of these domains must improve. There's no one concept that is more important than the other. A fundamental argument then is that when we think about responding to crises such as COVID-19, is that we can't think of it solely as an economic crisis or a health crisis, but instead need to be thinking about how we respond to an intersecting and complex systems of economic, health, and social problems. So for a resilient and inclusive recovery, we would want to be hitting each of these four areas to ensure sustainable building blocks are allowing us to use the structures of an inclusive economy and society in the future that can also prepare us for any further crises that may occur.
So the Social Progress Index offers an accessible and actionable assessment of the health of society that is completely independent of any economic measure. So it's a framework that aims to capture not just present challenges and today's priorities, but also the challenges that regions will face as their economic prosperity rises. The index reveals relative performance compared to a country or state or region's economic peers, and then assesses their success in turning their economic progress into improved social outcomes. So the SBI is distinct from other tools in that it includes only social and environmental indicators, and it also measures outcomes instead of inputs. So when we were creating Australia's Social Progress Index, that means that we were less interested in, for example, how much money was spent on a campaign to enrol more children in preschool, but instead we focused more on the proportion of children who actually ended up in preschool. So the index offers what we call universally important questions. So these are concerns that are relevant to any country, state, or territory, and any indicator that we included in the index needed to be aimed at addressing one of these questions that you see there. So over the last 18 months, we have been going through a process of consultation with academics, members of the for-purpose sector, businesses invested in the Sustainable Development Goals, and also conversations with local government to really think about what we can use as indicators to best answer those questions. It wasn't just a question of what indicators we should include, but it also was a process of working out what data was actually available in Australia. So to calculate the SPI, we needed to use data sources and indicators that were being consistently measured across all the states and territories of Australia, and also ones that were updated annually. So that actually ended up turning into a much bigger challenge than we first expected. So this process of identifying the indicators that were available and then also setting the limits of what we thought would be the best and the worst case scenarios for Australia's social progress led us to this. So this image shows how Australia's states and territories are performing relative to one another on overall social progress. So it's also important to make clear here that these scores are how socially progressive the society and its policies are, not the people that live there. We were able to calculate the SPI scores as well between 2015 and 2018, and we ranked the states and territories both on overall social progress, but then we also ranked them on each domain and each component within the SPI framework. So as a brief overview of the results that we got, between 2015 and 2018, we did see some consistent trends. So ACT was consistently the #1 region every year, and then Western Australia and the Northern Territory placed 7th and 8th respectively each year. In 2018, which was the most recent SPI score, Tasmania ranked 3rd and South Australia ranked 5th on overall social progress. Also, just to briefly note, these are the scores for the state and territory as a whole. So in future, we will hopefully be able to calculate the index that reflects things like remoteness or cultural and religious differences, experiences of people with a disability, etc. So for each day this week during this series of webinars, we'll be focusing on a different state or territory and exploring their SPI scores. So we'll be doing a deep dive into their scorecards and where they ranked compared to other states and territories. We've also mapped each state's performance with their policy response to COVID to see where there are existing vulnerabilities in the state and then how the state government responded during the pandemic. We'll also cover how the SPI relates to the Sustainable Development Goals and how different regions are progressing towards achieving those goals. To understand these scores a little bit better, we'll also zero in on some of the indicators used to make up the SPI scores and talk about what we can take away from both the index findings and also where we see we need to make some improvements. So focusing today on South Australia and Tasmania, how would you describe those two states? So kind of looking at the state where you're calling in from or just how your general perception of the state is, how do you kind of see South Australia or Tasmania? Feel free to put it in the chat box there, how you describe, the community where you live or the state where you live. We did a quick whip around our office talking about these two states, and we came up with some of these ones that you see on the slide there. So, South Australia has their wine and their churches, as well as being quite environmentally progressive in terms of their energy use. Tasmania is similarly thought of as quite environmentally conscious, but it's kind of seen as more settled with families or older individuals in the state. And it's also, sometimes seen as a bit separated and isolated from Australia in the fact that it is an island state. So I can also see in some of the chat there that people, say that South Australia is, known for lots of wineries, lots of desert, and then, some old wealth as well in South Australia. So they're really interesting impressions that we have, and just these outside perceptions often, particularly as Megan and I are outsiders to these states. So in going through this, it's been a really interesting process of aligning these perceptions of a place against then actually looking at the scores that they got on the SPI and also their data.
So today we're taking a look at both South Australia and Tasmania. And when understanding how an individual state or territory is performing in components of social progress, we can look at a score relative to its economic peers. And so this is relevant because of the two-way stream between economic and social progress. So it's not reasonable for us to assume that less wealthy jurisdictions commit the same resources to policy as wealthier areas. But scorecards such as this help us to understand how a state or territory is performing on elements of social progress relative to their 4 closest states or territories in terms of gross state product per capita, which is our more localized version of GDP. So the shading that you see on scorecards indicates performance. Yellow indicates an SPI component score within 1 standard deviation of its peers, and it really indicates that they're performing within an expected range. Green is a score of greater than 1 standard deviation and indicates performance is better than expected. And red is for, as you probably guessed, below or more than 1 standard deviation worse than its peers, and it indicates that performance is worse than expected. It's not possible for every state to be performing better than its peers, but ideally we want to be working towards a future where we get a scorecard that are all yellow for all states and territories. So this is South Australia's scorecard. And you can see that for the most part, South Australia is performing within the expected range compared to its economic peers. There are a number of components, however, where the scores are below what is expected compared to South Australia's economic peers, which were Tasmania, Victoria, Queensland, and New South Wales. And this includes nutrition and basic medical care, access to basic knowledge, and access to information and communications. However, we'll also note that South Australia is performing better than expected in both shelter and inclusiveness. Now, if we move on to Tasmania's scorecard, similar to South Australia, for the most part, and in overall social progress, Tasmania is performing within the expected range of its economic peers. However, it's also performing highly in environmental quality and as well as personal rights and personal freedom and choice. The area in which Tasmania is underperforming is also of interest, and this includes access to information and communication, health and wellness, and access to higher education. Some of these are expected as Tasmania has historically had lower levels of digital inclusion due to socioeconomic disadvantage and less developed telecommunication infrastructure, particularly in rural areas. In terms of higher education, Tasmania is also a state with only 1 university, which can significantly affect accessibility. So we released the index in February this year with the intention of engaging with individual state and territory governments to discuss how the SPI can be used as a way of determining policy priorities and addressing areas of social progress that were found to be particular vulnerabilities based on their scores. But like a lot of things this year, the plan got interrupted when COVID began and became a bigger threat in Australia, and we shifted towards working remotely, as well as government and university priorities significantly shifting in a short period of time. One thing that we did notice, however, is that it's difficult understanding and interpreting various policies and stimulus packages when they're being released daily and we're keeping an eye on sort of what infection rates and things look like. And the SPI framework actually, for us, became a really useful way of understanding and interpreting what was receiving attention and was being understood as the big issues of COVID. So I'll flag that we make 2 assumptions here with our analysis. The first is that where a government chooses to spend its money is indicative of where it places its priorities. And then the second is that we should conservatively expect that without targeted policy attention, pre-existing inequalities are likely to deepen when going into a period of crisis such as a pandemic. So what we did then was look at each policy or stimulus package announced at both state and federal governments and judged whether the policy fit within a particular component of the social progress framework or whether it was a measure that was focused only on the economy or employment. And this mapping could go both ways. So policies could be aiming to target a particular social issue, such as increased funding for homelessness services, but also on-the-spot fines have potential risks for personal rights if they're handed out in ways that target particular groups of people that have historically been disproportionately policed. So we note here that this analysis isn't intended to reveal how well a government is responding to COVID, but instead gives us an insight into where policy priorities are being concentrated or require more attention. The analysis that we're talking through today is based on a fact sheet that we published initially in July and we updated this week. And the link to the full paper, I believe Rhonda is adding to the comments. And it's a living document, so we're updating about fortnightly at this stage with new policies as they're announced.
Great. So in looking at South Australia's policy response to COVID, we can see here that there are responses that have aligned with areas of social progress where the state had previously been underperforming. So during the pandemic, South Australia has had a really good response in stopping transmission. The dollar for dollar spending isn't exactly comparable. but also focusing responses on things like upgrading country hospitals and supporting community pharmacies, and also ensuring communities are accessible virtually, have all been really important to ensure that responses to COVID don't just benefit the people living in urban areas or in the cities. So this is something that hasn't been able to be captured so well in the SPI up to this point, as we mentioned. It is something that we want to do in the future. Unfortunately, just the data granularity isn't at the stage where we're able to be making those distinctions. So it is important to kind of keep an equity lens in mind when thinking about who is benefiting from a policy and who stands to need it the most. There's also, as you can see here, no additional funding for social housing or supports to address personal safety, such as domestic violence funding. So this could lead to potential further vulnerabilities, particularly as we have seen rates of domestic violence increase nationally during the COVID lockdowns. And now for the Tasmania COVID response. So in the scorecards and overall SPI scores, Tasmania was underperforming in access to information and communication, health and wellness, and access to advanced education, as we mentioned. And as we said, it is possible that some of these limitations are due to Tasmania being an island state. So there are particular practicalities when implementing that infrastructure and those services. However, there was good policy support for TAFE skills re-education, as well as mental health support for people living in Tasmania. There was also quite a good response to school access, and also an increased demand for family and domestic violence and homelessness services. In terms of economic support, you can see there on the right that Tasmania was definitely putting its investment into industries that it relies on, so things such as fisheries and aircraft transport. As an area for concern, however, there was a lack of funding or support for access to information and communications, which is an area that Tasmania is already underperforming compared to its relative peers. So we can make an assumption there that potentially without prioritising this area, there is a risk during COVID that this could deepen the inequities that already exist within Tasmania. So another new application of the Australian SPI that we can show you today is how we've used the Australian SPI scores to give an indication of how each state and territory is progressing towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, also known as the SDGs. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the SDGs, they are a set of 17 integrated goals that were adopted by all United Nations member states in 2015 as a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and also ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity by the year 2030. So they were created as a replacement to the Millennium Development Goals that originally set out to respond to and tackle global indignity and poverty. So Australia is a signatory to the goals. However, there are two recognised issues in Australia. That first, a lot of the focus in Australia has been more on assisting in implementing these goals in developing countries, so particularly in the Pacific region. But there hasn't actually been much recognition given the fact that we also need to be ensuring that the goals are being met in Australia. Secondly, there's also no clear strategy towards measuring and reporting on attaining these goals in Australia. So as a consequence, the goals can be seen as something that people can really get behind, but then there's no real way of measuring it that's being put in place to track how Australia is actually progressing towards ultimately meeting the goals. So the Social Progress Index framework was developed with the SDGs in mind. So we are able to kind of use these components to give us an insight into how each state and territory is actually progressing towards these SDGs using a proxy measure.
So when we say proxy, we do so recognising that the scorecard indicators are based on what data is available and appropriate to the SPI methodology. And the scores are derived by calculating the average of all the component scores that were judged to contribute to a particular goal. However, this is definitely a first in terms of getting a comparative measure of how states and territories are progressing towards achieving the goals. And similar to the economic peer scorecards, can give us an insight into areas where there needs to be more attention needed as a matter of policy priority. So I know that there's a lot to take in on these scorecards, and depending on your screen size, you might not be able to see it well. So instead, at this stage, what we might do is dive into some of the higher scoring and lower scoring goals for both Tasmania and South Australia, and talk about what this means when aiming for sustainable social progress. So as you might be able to see from Australia's scores mapped to the SDGs, they're overwhelmingly scoring within the middle quintile with the score of 41 to 60 out of 100. The goals of zero hunger and shelter, however, are the highest performing with scores in the 70s. So zero hunger aims to end hunger and achieve food security by 2030, as well as improving sustainable agricultural practices. And goal 7, affordable and clean energy, aims to ensure that everyone has access to affordable and reliable energy through increased renewable energy targets and doubling the current rate of energy efficiency, both globally and then within Australia as well. So the way that we created proxy scores for each of these goals primarily centered around access to nutrition and basic medical care and shelter for both goals 2 and 7. For achieving zero hunger, indicators that could be used to understand South Australia and how well it's going at looking at this goal and achieving it is looking at both infant mortality and premature mortality rates, as well as social housing overcrowding. But remember, the SPI is measured based on outcome indicators. So when thinking about these scores, we're considering whether the indicator is a possible outcome, for example, of a lack of access to adequate nutrition. And similarly, affordable and clean energy was measured using the shelter component as a proxy measure. Using outcome indicators such as the estimated homelessness rate and rates of overcrowding provide insight into whether people actually have access to energy and utilities. And either experiencing homelessness or overcrowding would suggest that housing and the utilities that contribute to housing are more affordable and accessible for people living in South Australia compared to the rest of the country. But looking at some of the lower scoring goals for South Australia, these were goals 9 and 15. 9 being developing quality, reliable, sustainable and resilient infrastructure, including regional and transporter infrastructure, to support economic development and human wellbeing with a focus on affordable and equitable access for all. And 15, the goal is being that by 2020, which we are in now, is that we ensure that the conservation, restoration of sustainable use of terrestrial and inland forest ecosystems and their services, in particular forest, wetlands, mountains and drylands, in line with obligations under international agreements. So for the moment, these are the 2 of the goals that we would suggest South Australia needs to be paying targeted attention to. So if we're looking at how South Australia is faring in achieving industry, innovation and infrastructure, we looked at components that included access to advanced education and communications. And South Australia scored lower on indicators such as the rate of young people not in employment, education or training, rates of post-high school enrolment, as well as digital access and affordability. And the environmental indicators for South Australia, I would say, are more complicated. So when we were searching for nationally consistent indicators and what we could use to meaningfully contribute to understandings of environmental quality, we actually found that South Australia hadn't been updating their air quality index publicly in the timeframe that we were looking for. And air quality index scores were what primarily we needed to use to calculate environmental quality. So this means that we needed to substitute in scores for South Australia, and the scores that we have here at the moment are a conservative estimate of performance. However, it does highlight the importance of consistent measurement, particularly if we're wanting to understand how we are progressing towards achieving the SDGs. And it's difficult to get a good understanding of where there needs to be progress if we don't actually have the data to direct our attention.
So now looking at Tasmania's scores for each SPI component mapped onto the Sustainable Development Goals, you can see from, again, probably this quite tiny font, but you can see that Tasmania scores quite highly on almost all the goals, with most of them in the second highest quintile and then the rest in the middle quintile. So these are pretty impressive scores, considering that Tasmania is often perceived as being a little bit more isolated and perhaps a little bit less developed than most other states and territories in Australia. So in looking at some of the highest scoring SDG goals for Tasmania, it was goal 15 and goal 12. So these are the goals that aim to, same as with South Australia, to protect, restore and promote sustainable use of land ecosystems. And then also Tasmania scored highly on the goal to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. So the SPI components that we use to create these proxy scores and where we can see Tasmania performing the best on the SPI are those related to environmental quality and water and sanitation as well. So in particular, Tasmania scored better than its peers in terms of water stress and also levels of PM2.5, which we used as an indicator of air quality. The rate of waterborne diseases and also the prevalence of water interruption across the state were also two indicators where Tasmania scored better than its economic peers. This may not be too surprising to some, as Tasmania is frequently cited as having clean air and having clean water, and it is seen as being one of the more kind of environmentally conscious and environmentally friendly states in Australia. Now looking at some of the lowest scoring SDG scores for Tasmania, these included both quality education and then sustainable cities and communities. So these are the goals that aim to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning for all. And also the goal that looks at making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. So you can see here on this next slide, some of the relevant indicators that we use to calculate these proxy SDG scores. So in particular, Tasmania scored lower on components relating to access to basic and advanced education, as well as access to information and communications. So Tasmania has lower post-high school enrolment than its economic peers, and it also has lower NAPLAN reading scores. Digital affordability and access is also one of the poorer performing indicators for the state, which may be expected, as mentioned, because of less developed infrastructure. And Tasmania also has a relatively high youth offender rate compared to its economic peers. So this was an indicator that we use to calculate overall personal safety, and in this case contributes to the lower score for the SDG goal 11.
An important thing to talk about as we talk about the index scores and scorecards is to acknowledge and recognize that there's this inherent tension that kind of exists between perceptions and data. So one thing that we notice when asking about perceptions of a state or territory, both within our office, but when talking more generally about the SPI, is that we often think back and we think about states and territories usually describing a capital city or well-known areas, and that perception doesn't necessarily reflect the lived experience or sort of the realities of other areas that aren't necessarily thought of as easily. And this leads to a second point, that location matters. Due to data availability at this stage, we were only able to calculate an Australian SPI at a state and territory level, which inevitably leads to what we call a smoothing effect. So you're seeing averages across the entire jurisdiction rather than being able to detect nuance that exists between, for example, metro and remote areas. This is a definite goal that we have with the SPI moving forward, and it's to invest in data collection and measurement that we can start seeing how different local communities across Australia are faring on social progress. The other thing to note with the SPI scores is that each score is how a jurisdiction is performing relative to all other states and territories in Australia. So this means that there may be instances where there is an area for improvement in South Australia, for example, social housing overcrowding, which is an issue we've heard from a number of people. But based on the current available data, there are actually other jurisdictions that are having greater issues in delivering good services related to social housing. Another important point for me that I want to express is that we often talk about data as if it's this apolitical or neutral tool. But what we measure and how we measure it actually really matters. If we don't measure the impact of a social problem, it's easy to say that it doesn't exist. And similarly, how we phrase a survey question or the way that we present data contributes to particular narratives and interpretations, which then guides policy and decision making. So I'm definitely not trying to say that the SPI is not part of this, but instead I'm trying to encourage both within myself and others who use and talk about the SPI to be willing to critique how it is that we collect data and through discussion, identify priorities or gaps in data collection and advocate for that to change. And finally, an SPI score is an indication of the socially progressiveness of the policies and structures within South Australia and Tasmania, not the people living within it. It is also the case that individual lived experience may be vastly different to the picture being painted by the SPI scores. We don't want to invalidate those experiences, but instead it's our hope that we can be using the SPI framework as a way of understanding how basic human needs and foundations for wellbeing and opportunity are not being met, and together work towards solutions for better policy and decision making.
So kind of summing up, if we're looking at where, there are things that we can celebrate within these two states, both from the SPI and in the SDG scorecards, South Australia is performing really well on indicators of inclusiveness. So the ability to participate in your community, and also scoring really well on shelter. Similarly, Tasmania is performing really well on indicators of environmental quality and also doing really well on the ability to practice personal rights and personal freedom and choice. However, when we consider the scorecards and the SDG progress, we also see the need to focus on basic needs such as health, as well as access to information and communication. So this was a substantial area of underperformance for both South Australia and Tasmania. And we also need to consider how the impact of that underperformance in one area of social progress, such as access to information and communication, can have then flow-on effects to other areas of social progress, such as the ability to access both basic and advanced education. So as we mentioned earlier, the SPI framework isn't intended to be considered as siloed issues or focuses, but instead decision-making needs to consider how these components of overall social progress work in tandem with each other to be able to improve access and equity for everyone.
So we want the SPI to be a tool that can help inform better policy. As I've mentioned, it can function as a tool to give insight where there are areas of social progress that are flourishing for particular jurisdictions. And by using a standardised measure where states and territories can be compared, we can better demonstrate where outcomes are quantifiably improving societies. We believe that everyone can find a component within the SPI that best represents their cause. So if you're a Minister for Education, for example, looking at access to both basic and advanced educations in Australia should help identify where there are opportunities for development. It also encourages collaboration. We want this to be a tool that can help governments to partner with the not-for-profit and for-purpose sector to partner on shared causes as represented by components in the index, and to help identify opportunities to work together to achieve common goals. The first Australian Social Progress Index provides the opportunity of the beginning of a conversation about how we could measure social progress within Australia. As a first step, it's a tool that is using best available data to demonstrate the extent to which basic human needs, foundations of wellbeing and opportunity are playing out across Australia's states and territories. And it helps to shift our attention away solely from economic indicators as measures of progress, but to start talking about progress in terms of inclusive growth. Looking into the future, there are lots of ways that we can use the Social Progress Index to look deeper into Australia's progress towards achieving basic human needs, the wellbeing and opportunity for the people that live here. So at a more local level, we could calculate a sub-state Social Progress Index. So for example, we could focus only on Tasmania, but drill down to more granular data and create a Social Progress Index framework that is more reflective of the values and goals that Tasmania has. Ideally, we would love to create a national social progress index at a local government level, which would allow us to then compare these scores across these smaller regions and provide greater insight into exactly where in Australia things are progressing well and where they are not, and on which components. So in particular, it would allow us to compare between metro and regional or rural areas, which we know can differ greatly in levels of social progress, but unfortunately can't be disaggregated in our current SPI. So while the lack of data at this level currently makes calculating a local government index difficult, another option is also to create a framework only. And this has actually been done in Reykjavik in Iceland. And so here we would go through consultation and map different indicators that align to the SPI components, but aren't currently being collected consistently across the country. And then we see community engagement as an important factor in each of these. So engaging with community and understanding how it is that people think about progress. And then we would want to make sure that we include community voices on what social progress actually means to them, what is important, and where we are planning to go as a society. So that's the overview of what Tasmania and South Australia is looking like on social progress at the moment. But we are doing these webinars all week, as Rhonda mentioned, and I believe she's going to put up a link for the other states and territories. If you're interested, please come along. But we are always very happy to talk about SBI and answering any questions that you might have at this stage as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Megan and Isabella. We do have a few questions, and I have already added the link to the chat feed for anyone interested in coming to other webinars this week. We do have a question from Zenny around if you need to register for each webinar to receive the recording. We'd love you to come, but no, you don't need to do that. I'll send all the recordings out at the same time next Monday in one email. So Megan and Isabella, a few questions for you. First one being, what's next for the SPI? How are you going about sourcing more data for your research? And I love this one. Are there ways that the philanthropic community can help, either through funding research or sharing data?
Do you want me to take that one, Isabella?
Yes, go for it.
So one thing that we maybe didn't say in the presentation is that we didn't actually do any primary data collection ourselves. Part of the methodology is to use already existing publicly available data. But what we did find is that there's a number of different indicators that are being collected across the country, either within a state or territory, or you know, as part of another university's research work. That would potentially be really great to include in the index, but either because of the sample size or because you know, it was focused within a state or territory, we couldn't include it. So we don't necessarily want to you know, bring all the money into us so that we can start having like all the indicators and do all the collection ourselves, but we want to have that connection of identifying who's already collecting good indicators and what can we do to kind of direct attention to amp up their ability to improve their sample sizes, for example. But we are starting to have conversations with the philanthropic and for-purpose sector about, you know, what does future measurement look like? And that's definitely a conversation that we're keen to have with a large number of people, to not try and hold that all ourselves. So definitely get in touch if that's something that you are wanting to contribute to or have questions about. But yeah, I mean, I think it's about also identifying where there are data vulnerabilities at the moment, where we're not currently measuring really important things around, you know, for example, experiences of racism, you know, and identifying what our priorities are at the moment in terms of collecting good data and sort of advocating to get that stuff collected first. So that's kind of where we're at in terms of sourcing more data.
Great, thank you. And I will share Megan's and Isabella's details in the follow-up email I send, along with all those links that we've mentioned. Another question for you, are the data or the framework of indicators publicly accessible?
Yes, they are. So all of the indicators that we used and their data sources are included in our methodology report, which is available on the CSI SPI website, which Rhonda has shared in the chat.
But I will do it again.
Yes.
Someone's asked, and I don't know how to say this, but have you looked at AURIN? REM. Do you know what that is? AURIN. It's not in the chat feed. It was sent to me privately.
Oh, okay. It doesn't come to the, I don't think it's coming right to my mind at the moment, but definitely happy to have a conversation about that and to check that out as well. I know that there's a few sort of different data sourcing kind of software and stuff like that that's going on. So yeah, keen to kind of have conversations about how that can contribute in the future.
Yeah, that's something as well that Megan and I are constantly keeping in mind, is just getting in touch with experts and people who work in the social purpose sector for each of those different components as well, because you know, it's such a broad range of issues, and it is, you know, it's possible that there are some data sources available for these different areas that we might not be aware of. So yeah, we're always open to consultations.
Yeah.
And Jenny's just shared the link for that organisation.
We'll check it out.
Yeah, we'll check it out. Well, I won't. You guys will. Another question, what was the most surprising or unexpected result for you for South Australia and Tasmania?
I think perhaps the most surprising thing for me from these two states was actually how well across the board Tasmania did, and that they actually outperformed even states like Victoria on a lot of components. I think that really goes back to kind of the discussion and what Megan and I were saying about perceptions versus reality. And then, it was interesting looking a bit deeper into it. And, there obviously were areas where Tasmania does still need to have a little bit more of a focus or prioritization on things like access to information communications and education and things like that. But I think I was pleasantly surprised by how well they did on access, ability to cater for people's personal rights and freedom and choice and things like that. So that was probably, the most pleasantly surprising thing for me, I suppose.
Megan?
For me, I think it's always interesting to look at these scorecards, just to kind of get a sense, as Isabella was saying, when we're looking at Tasmania's performance on the SDGs, if you've got good performance across a range of indicators, that's going to give you a better kind of overall average score. Whereas if you're sort of doing really well in some components, but not so well in others, that means that you're going to go really well in some goals. But generally what we're wanting to see is that we're progressing across the board well. And so I think that's what Tasmania has particularly demonstrated. And yeah, I think it's definitely kind of, the fact that we've got to consider the environment in all of this. Like, the environment is a big focus of the Sustainable Development Goals. And even though it's only one component of the SPI framework, it's still really important. It links into other things. It links into health. It links into shelter, into, even just things like personal rights. So, prioritizing environment as well when we are talking about social progress is really important.
So we know that this is my last question. So if anyone has any others, please add them to the chat feed. Otherwise, we can wrap up after this one. So we know that with South Australia, the performance on shelter has been surprising to a few people. Can you go into that one in a bit more detail?
Yeah, so this is one that it's complex, and we're definitely not wanting to understate the fact that, that we've been told and we hear that there is an issue with social housing affordability, availability in South Australia. And that's also, probably an issue of metro versus more rural areas. And I think what's important to highlight with that is the fact that, we're not wanting to say that South Australia doesn't have a problem with social housing availability, for example. It's just that when we're using these indicators that's comparing to the rest of Australia, South Australia at the moment is doing better relative to its peers or relative to the rest of Australia. But one of the things that we do when we're creating the social progress index is set what we call best and worst case scenarios as kind of our way of locating the scores within, it could go forever otherwise. And so we take it with the approach that you can always do better. There's always room for improvement. And so even though South Australia might be ranking first on shelter, for example, they're not getting 100 out of 100. There's always room for improvement. And so that's something that we really hope that people that are, in the housing space, that they can use the index as a way of being like, there must be something that we're doing okay within policy at the moment, but there's still room to improvement. And how can we improve this score over time? I hope that kind of answers it, but definitely recognizing that that is a complexity, and that kind of fits with what we were saying earlier about sort of the perceptions or what's going on in the lived experience versus the scores.
That definitely answers it. Thank you. Okay, well, I think we've got a comment from Zenny, or the whole country not doing well with housing.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Zenny.
Yeah.
Very good point to end. Thanks so much to you both, Megan and Isabella, for your time today and all of this week. I encourage everyone to come along to any other webinars that they're interested in this week, or other Impact 2020 webinars, which we normally hold on a monthly basis, just one a month normally. And you can find out more about that on impact2020.online. Otherwise, we'll finish up for today, and I will be in touch on Monday next week with a whole heap of resources and links and the recordings. So thanks everyone, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.